What's up?
Hey, Vince, how you doing?
I'm busy. How you guys doing?
Doing good.
Doing good. Good to
Well,
see
let's
you.
finish up where, that show we were doing last week was pretty good, and we got a lot more to cover. What did you say?
Yeah.
So, welcome back. We got Rob, Gurkha, and J.J. Ellen from Perry's Music. Thanks for being on the show, part two.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's good to have you here. We covered a lot of good subjects last week. For people that didn't watch last week and they're seeing part two, go to my website, busyguy.co, to watch part one. But if you already watched part one, can it make it more confusing for you? Let's talk about guitars. Where we left off, we were talking about the guitars we have on display, but the major changes, how the Beatles came about, how guitars sold like crazy. There was cheap guitars, there was better made guitars. So if we could talk a little bit about, start off with one of the major companies that everybody that knows guitars and people, even people that don't may know, have heard the name Gibson. What can you tell me about Gibson guitars?
Well, Gibson's making a lot of guitars. They're responsible for one of the most iconic guitars, which is the Les Paul, which was designed by Mr. Les Paul himself. It was a group effort that Les Paul actually went to Gibson. He had various designs, and together they built what today is an iconic guitar. Various different models available, different price ranges. Very
a
good.
major force in guitar making. And there's a story behind Les Paul. Besides being a musician, was an inventor and other things that he added to the industry.
Well, absolutely. Les Paul was known as the Wizard of Waukesha from Waukesha, Wisconsin. And originally he started off as a guitar player and a solo act, and he eventually got together with a woman who later became his wife, Mary Ford, and they had the Les Paul and Mary Ford duel. And a lot of people don't realize, but Les Paul was a huge tinkerer, as was Leo Fender, one of the originators of the electric guitar. And Les Paul had been working with Gibson on days off in the factory. He had a thing he had called the log, which was basically a big piece of lumber that he had attached some strings and a bridge onto, and a pickup that he had made out of a phonograph needle at one time. And well, as things had evolved, Gibson had also developed the electronic pickup, so he was kind of tinkering with this thing called the log. Well, at the time, Fender was the first company to make a production electric guitar that was very popular. And Gibson, who had been known more for their jazz guitars and acoustical guitars, felt that they had to get into the market. But as they were known for making very expensive, fancy jazz guitars, they didn't want to just make this slab of wood called an electric guitar like Fender was doing. They kind of looked down their nose at it. And they said, well, if we're going to have a guitar, we've got to have something unique. So with Les Paul's idea of the log, which was basically this guitar that they attached wings to, they decided they had to dress it up and make it look like a Cadillac. So the first ones, the Les Paul Customs, were made with a black finish to emulate a tuxedo. They went with black and white. And then the other model they made was what they call a Les Paul Gold Top guitar, which was a very unique gold metallic sparkle that was very classy looking. They definitely wanted to separate themselves from the competition, who they, like I said, they kind of looked down their nose at these upstarts in California that started a guitar company with just a slab of wood.
And what's the myth about, actually it's a true story, but about him being in a car accident and broke his arm. What can you tell us about that?
Well, when he was on tour with Mary Ford, at that time even the stars would drive around the country themselves from gig to gig, and they were, I forget where, I think it was somewhere on the East Coast, driving in very bad weather with their big car, at that time probably a Cadillac. They had a fairly serious accident. I think the car flipped over, and Les Paul had broken his arm. And the doctor said, you're never going to play a guitar again where your arm is just shattered. And he says, well, Doc, if you've got to set it in such a way where I can still hold a pick and play the guitar. And they did. And from that day on, that's how his arm was. But he was still able to play guitar, which was his love.
Well, it's like the joke that the guy goes to the doctor, gets surgery on his arm, and he says, Doc, am I going to be able to play guitar after surgery? He says, yeah. He says, good. Well, because I couldn't play before. You know?
Right.
But enough of that. Then to move on to other things, you know, you mentioned pickups. The name that I know, probably the only name of pickups I know, is humbucker pickups. What can you tell me about them?
Well, there's a lot of different kinds today, different manufacturers. Gibson being, you know, some of the first with what they called their patent applied for pickup, which is still popular today. But other companies like DiMarzio, Seymour Duncan Company, they've all taken that original design and changed it, made it better, made it louder. In today's rock and roll, made it much hotter so it distorts easier.
So is humbucker a brand?
No, humbucker's a type of
Oh, it
pickup.
is?
Yeah, it's a type of pickup. In most cases, they take two single coils of wire and parallel them together, and that cancels hum.
There you go,
That's
humbucker.
humbucker,
Bucking hum.
cancels the
Get rid of
hum.
the hum.
Right,
The hum.
especially, again, in today's world where a lot of the rock and roll is very distorted. Using a single coil pickup with that, and you stop playing, it's nothing but well, the humbucker, you stop playing and it's quiet.
Really? And I know there's other, obviously I'm not an expert by you guys, but one name that I know comes to mind is for keys is Grover keys. Mm-hmm. What can you tell me about them? I mean, did they pioneer something, or they're better than the others?
I think Grover was one of the first companies to make what they call a sealed gear tuner. If you look at a guitar like that Martin guitar that I was playing before, if you look at the sides where the strings are tuned, you have a very simple gear, which is open like a worm gear, that when you turn the tuning machine, the gear turns and you tighten the string up. But they're exposed to the air, they can tarnish, and that the Grover Company invented a machine head that where the gear mechanism was encased in a die-cast metal casing that was sealed with a grease, which made a very smooth lubricating of the gears, and it caught on. It was like a deluxe tuner, and it's been a deluxe tuner to this day.
And it has more longevity because it's lubricated as well, where a lot of the open tuners like that will wear out over time just from friction.
Interesting. So it stays sealed.
Mm-hmm.
It stays sealed. Well, while we're on the subject of parts of guitars, what can you tell me about strings? I mean, I know we talked earlier on the first show about, you know, nylon and catgut and all that, but in today's the strings that they're making.
Well, one thing I can tell you about strings, which was really kind of interesting, back in the 50s and 60s when rock and roll was first coming into vogue, most of the guitar playing that was done with chording versus single note playing. But what happened is they started doing what they would refer to now as leads, like Chuck Berry, Johnny B. Good, where they would take strings and play individual strings with the lead part, and they would bend the strings to get a certain sound. They would take a note and physically push the string over on the frets, which gives it like a singing type of tone. Well, the strings they used to use back then were pretty thick. So what a lot of players would do, they would take a 6-string set, they would throw away the 6th string, which was the thickest, and they would move all the strings up one, and then they would get a banjo string, which was a thinner gauge, and use that on their first string. So a whole industry developed around what they called thinner strings. A company by the name of Ernie Ball decided to call them slinkies. And they developed a new super slinkies,
Yep.
which is a thinner gauge of string. Bottom line is, the thinner the string, the easier it is to bend to get either bluesy tones or a singing tone out of it. Where you do lose some kinetic energy from the strings because there's not as much to vibrate. Then you get popular players that have passed on now, one like Stevie Ray Vaughan, who would use incredibly thick strings. He probably had a hand grip that could just take you down, but he would use these incredibly heavy strings that had a very powerful sound, but he could still bend them halfway across the fingerboard and get that very unique bluesy tone that's so popular with rock and roll.
Very
Yeah,
interesting.
and some players, what they'll do is they'll take a very thick string like that and they'll down tune the guitar. So they still have the tone of the thicker metals, but it's easier to bend because it's less tension because they've down tuned it a step or two.
Wow. I mean, because it's like anything, I know, because if you come into your store, you see there's a range of them, and that's very interesting to learn. What about the Fender Company? Can you tell me? And the famous models that they have?
Yeah. Well, the Fender Company, Leo Fender back in the 50s, he had a radio TV shop in Fullerton, California. And at that time, he mostly did radio TV repair and built public sound systems for old community use and things like that. He would rent them out to bands and to the community. But in the late 40s, he got together with a guy by the name of Doc Kaufman, and they took guitars and they figured, because especially back then, a lot of people don't know it, but country music was very popular in California. And in Texas, there was the, what they call the Bakersfield scene in California, where there was a lot of country western artists, and they were looking for ways to get their guitars amplified. And he used to create pickups from them, which is basically just a coil of wire and a magnet structure, and he would put them onto their acoustical guitars. But then he kind of came up with an idea to take a plank of wood with a neck on it and put in this metal bridge and then the metal strings with the electronic pickup where you could amplify the guitar and get more volume out of it. Now, I mean, there had been experimentation with pickups before him, so he wasn't the first one, but he was the first one to probably make it into a commercially available product that could be mass-produced, not unlike the the Model T cars with Henry Ford.
Yeah. And then, it would be amiss if we didn't talk about amplifiers because, I mean, the names that come to mind that I remember, but the Beatles had Vox. There was Fender, the Bandmaster, the Bassmaster. What other companies come to mind?
Marshall.
Marshall.
Marshall amps were good. That was the rock and roll amp. They came along a little later.
They're American made?
Those are actually British made.
Is that right?
Yep. Absolutely.
During the 1950s, the tube radios were very popular, and Leo Fender took circuits from the RCA tube book, which were basically tube amplification circuits, and designed them into guitar amps. An interesting side note with Jim mentioning the Marshall, with the English music scene, they basically took a Fender amplifier, brought it over to England, and they copied it and changed it slightly, made a little bit different tonality. Plus, with the parts that they had available, they were different from the American parts. So they ended up creating this amplifier that had a unique mid-range tone that a lot of the guitar players of the 60s, like Jimi Hendrix, Eric Clapton from the Cream, they picked up this tone of this amplifier, which was unique, and Marshall has become kind of like the classic amp of rock and roll.
Yep.
That's pretty much who put them on the map, you think? What about Peter Townsend? He used Marshalls?
Pete Townsend? Yeah, originally, earlier he used Marshall amps. Later on in his career, he used high watt amps, which were also British made at the time.
What about, before we get off of Fender, I know there's a company that exists now that's got a tie-in to him, and I know you guys visited the factory in California. You want to tell me a little bit about that?
That would be the G&L factory, which is basically Leo Fender's later company after he left Fender and sold Fender. He, for whatever reason, he was a tinkerer and he loved to build things, and he couldn't keep his hands out of it. So he started G&L Guitars, and he tried to improve upon his original designs with Fender. In a lot of cases, he did just that. Bridges and tremolo systems that would stay in tune better, pickups which have a little bit louder output, very smooth. Used some of the most beautiful woods ever. I mean, he really did a nice job. And up until the day he died, he I don't think he ever rested. He just kept building and designing. And
what about the office that you were talking about?
As a tribute, the G&L company left his office exactly the way it was the day he died. And you go in there, and there are parts and pickups and wire and tools and chunks of wood. It's just incredible to see. It really looks haphazard, like a bomb exploded.
Right? I mean, it's a living testament.
It's got tobacco cans around with parts in them and stuff, and it's really unique. Leo Fender was really not as much of a guitar player as he was a tinkerer, but like Jim had mentioned, he loved to take things and constantly perfect them. It wasn't enough that he invented it or designed it. He had now what can I do to make it better? Leo Fender sold the original Fender company in the mid-'60s to CBS Broadcasting Company, and he had to stay out of the business for about 5 years. And then he reformed a company called G&O, as Jim had mentioned. The G was for George Fullerton, which was one of his original partners at Fender, and Leo Fender. And like Jim mentioned, he continued that on until literally the day he died. He was working in his office the day before he died and on a new design for a guitar.
Died with his boots on.
Literally, yeah. He
absolutely.
just loved the music business and loved guitars.
Yeah. Well, you guys grew up in Chicago. I'm sure you remember Lion and Healy.
Really, right?
Oh, I can tell you stories about that.
I don't know if I'm the only one that remembers, but in the window on Wabash, they had a guitar. I don't know if it was Gibson or Fender. It might have been a Gibson, hollow body guitar that was built to scale, but it was like huge. It was like, you know, the size of a Volkswagen. I don't know if you remember that in the window, but
Absolutely.
you do. Good.
Yeah.
I thought I was the only one.
No, back in the day, there in the late '60s, you know, Lion and Healy was a huge store downtown Chicago, and the music department for guitars was on the 7th floor. I'll never forget that. I used to go to Lane Tech High School in Chicago.
That's where I went. I didn't know that.
There you go, yeah. And I'd jump on the bus after school, and I'd go down into the loop and go on the 7th floor of Lion and Healy. The guitar you're referring to was a giant guitar produced by the Harmony Company. They made a giant guitar, as you say, probably as big as a Volkswagen, obviously that they would use for trade shows and that to catch people's attention, which it certainly did.
Yeah.
But it was actually a functional guitar. It was probably 12 feet tall.
I wonder what that thing is now.
I'm sure it's in some collector's hand. I bet you could probably pump it up on the internet and find out where it's at.
Well, while we're on that subject, I mean, Wabash had all. There was Frank's Drum Shop. There was all the Carl Fisher.
Absolutely.
I was just talking to somebody about that the other day. How, you know, and I know you sell sheet music, but back in the day, if you thought of a song and you wanted to get the sheet music, you'd have to go down to Carl Fisher or other places. Now you just type it in on the computer and it's there for you. But
Yeah, that changed the whole aspect. You know, like the internet has changed so much, both for the better and for worse. Sheet music has almost become a thing of the past.
yeah.
The companies that sell it have had to adapt with either method books or the ways to get instant printing out for online demand and stuff. It's quite a changing marketplace.
Yeah. Well, another thing that technology has changed, and I'm sure you remember, is effects pedals. There was the wah-wah.
Yep.
And you had to have a separate pedal for each sound. Now they got a box this big, right? That
Does
do everything for
almost everything. You know, you can. Most of that, the younger generation likes the all-in-one thing. It seems that the players out there, the older guys like me, unfortunately,
Amateur club.
yeah, they like the single stuff. They believe it has a better tone, and it has its own unique signature per pedal. It's a lot more messy,
Yeah.
but we feel
And
it
who
sounds
put the
better.
wah-wah? Hendrix and Terry Kath from Chicago put
Yeah.
the wah-wah.
Oh, yeah.
on the mix.
Eric Clapton, the Cream.
Yep.
What about the Ovation Company?
Well, I can tell you a little bit about the Ovation Company. It's very interesting, actually. Back in the 60s, a lot of people don't know this, the helicopter had kind of come into its own during the 50s and 60s, but originally they had a lot of problems with helicopters because even though the blades for the helicopter were made out of laminated wood and glued together, depending on the way they were used, they would often fail. So a guy by the name of Charlie Command, who was very good with synthetics, had an aerospace company, and he was one of the pioneers in developing successful helicopter blades with the type of epoxies and different things that he would use. But also being a musician with a certain amount of money from a very successful aerospace company, he decided he's going to take the traditional guitar and improve it. And what he came up with, he kind of realized that if you look at an orchestra, like in an outdoor setting, like in Chicago, at Grant Park, if you look at an orchestra bowl, it's a curved surface. So what he did, he figured, well, why should a guitar have a squared off back? If a guitar had a circular back, the sound would reflect and come out of the sound hole and give you a better, louder tone. So he took his experience with synthetics and he developed a material called Lyricord, and he designed this round back guitar, which had a round back made out of synthetic material, but a traditional wood top. Well, of course, at the time, a lot of inventors that make something, it won't always hit right off the bat. And some people, when it first came out with this, they didn't know what to do with it. It was very space age. Some people didn't like him, but he was able to get a guy that was very popular, Glenn Campbell, Some of us who are old enough to remember that era. Glenn Campbell was a very popular and very talented recording star. Actually, a lot of people don't know it, but he sat in with the Beach Boys on a number of tours when Brian Wilson was no longer able to tour with them.
I think I read, and he played with the Champs. They played Tequila.
Yeah, he played with the Champs, who later was also enveloped into Seals and Croft, and he played with the Beach Boys. Who else? You know, he played with a number of groups at the time.
Well, I know Cat Stevens helped put it on. I mean, that's why I bought an Ovation.
Yes.
You know, because it was that sound, and that's, you know, that they said that the sound, it pushed the sound out.
Absolutely. You know, another very important development too. At that time, a lot of the music that was developed into like a folk rock where they were using acoustical guitars along with electric guitars on stage. But to try to take an acoustical guitar and get it up to be loud enough to compete with a set of drums, the sound system, and guitar amplifiers, it just really couldn't be effectively done. So the Ovation Company was one of the first ones to come up with a successful pickup system that they could put it into an acoustical guitar, and they would take a pickup with a preamplifier. Actually, had a battery inside the guitar. They would take the signal from the strings, boost it up enough to send it through the cable to an amplifier where they could have an effective way to take an acoustical guitar and amplify it. Some of the other groups like Loggins and Messina, the Doobie Brothers back then.
Well, I could turn every conversation to the
Cat
Beatles,
Stevens.
but McCartney used it in the Wings Over America tour. Right?
Yes,
the 12-string.
and he would never allow them to attach his name with it.
Really?
They couldn't pay him enough to get him to endorse it, but they could not stop people from taking pictures of him using one.
Yeah.
Interesting bit of marketing there.
Well, in the book that I had showed you earlier, it talked about the Hofner bass that he put on the map, but he never endorsed it. But I don't know, they'd put a little slogan along with it. You know, Paul enjoys playing a Hofner.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe. But speaking of him, I tell you, I could turn all conversations to him into the Beatles. But left-handed guitars, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he was left-handed, played a right-handed guitar. Hendrix took a right-handed guitar and switched
Played
the
it up.
strings.
Yeah. Well, I think he actually played it backwards. Yeah, it would be upside down and backwards. But it
Look
was.
at
But
that.
Figure
yeah,
that out, right?
yeah,
There you go.
yeah. But
Imagine if he had the right guitar, what he would do.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, left-handed guitars are not nearly as popular as right-handed guitars. They're based on the left-handed players. There's not quite as many. You know, when we teach guitar, if someone's left-handed, we literally ask them to try it right-handed first.
That answers a question I was just going to
Yeah,
ask.
because your coordination when you're first beginning is not necessarily, you know, engraved in your head yet. Yeah. So if you're going to learn, at least try it right-handed to see if there's any problem there. Because if you can learn that way, you will be so glad you did, because there's so much more selection for right-handed guitars. Most of the left-handed guitars of any quality need to be special ordered. It's a hard time trying to find them in a store, and they're more expensive.
Well, once again, I mean, we could sit and talk for hours, but we're running a little bit short on time. Just one subject I want to cover is some of the things, you know, the future now with trends are changing, you know. There's these gimmicky guitar. It's a cardboard guitar, basically, you know, that the kids just touch it and play. There's Guitar Hero. You know, I was an experience of a reverse thing. People that, I said, oh, it's Guitar Hero. I play guitar. I have no problem with it. It has nothing to do with playing guitar. And another subject about, you know, female guitar players. There's, I mentioned a few to mention, Bonnie Raitt, the Wilson sisters, Evie Nicole.
Who's that?
Oh, that's my niece. I forgot to tell you.
Okay.
But yeah, and you know, and Hannah Montana's got little girls wanting to play guitars now,
Right.
and I know you guys are an example of that. And to tell me a little bit about what goes on at Perry's with Rock and Roll University.
Well, you know, one of the things that we do at Perry's Music, which really touches our heart, both Jim and I started off when we were young playing in bands. And nowadays it's hard for young people to get together and form their own band. I don't know why, like we did back in the 60s and that. So we offer a program called Perry's Rock and Roll University, where we take young people anywhere from 7 years old through high school. We put them in bands of similar talent and similar ages. We teach them to play rock and roll, basically pick songs, work together as a group, so it builds self-confidence, builds their skills in learning how to work with other kids. And at the end of the session, the kids record an original tune that we help them write, and then they play at a big venue where they can sell tickets to their friends and family and come and hear them play on a professional stage with a sound system, and it's really cool. A lot of parents remember seeing their kids play musical recitals back in the 60s and 70s, but it was often playing band instruments or something. To see your kid get up on stage and play classic rock and roll is really entertaining thing, and we think it's good to help kids learn how to get along together and play music.
Especially this generation, they can live vicariously through their kids, right?
Oh,
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the parents love it as much as the kids.
Yeah,
do.
absolutely.
Another big thing, because I'm I patronize your store, but a setup, a guitar setup. What can you tell us about that?
Well, guitars, because they're made out of wood, notoriously can become hard to play because the wood expands or contracts, and that can cause the neck to change. The strings come very high off the fingerboard, and it becomes hard to play. Most guitars require some type of maintenance every now and again to adjust them properly to make sure they're easily played. It's very, very easily seen if by how many guitars are out there that basically are hard to play. And especially for a new student, it's an injustice to them because they're trying to learn as it is. So one thing that we like to do with guitars is make sure they're set up properly so they're very easily played. I mean, for anybody, not necessarily just a student, but you will play better if the guitar is set up.
And it's something that's not a common practice at the big box stores.
Right, with the advent of the big box stores, whether it's in the hardware field, pet field, or whatever, music field, most of these big box stores are warehouse operations. They sell guitars right out of the box. Nothing wrong with that, but people don't understand that when you get a new guitar, even if you would think it's properly set up and ready to play, it's really not. If you were a professional musician like Eric Clapton, the last thing you would do would be to walk into a store, buy a guitar, and take it up on stage that night. Your professional sound person or guitar technician would probably spend hours on it to make sure it plays properly for them, just like a proper tool or a sports car.
And that's what you do at Perry's.
And that's what we do at Perry's Music.
And something that I read about you too that you must be so proud of is that a few of your instructors were your students.
Absolutely. We've got students that we used to teach 35 years ago that have now become teachers teaching at our school. And it's kind of interesting because a lot of the kids that used to come into the store on their bikes, but back when they were 10, 12 years old, now we're bringing in their kids 35 years later for music lessons and to purchase instruments and things.
And you cover a wide range. You've got voice lessons, drum, keyboards. All right. Listen, busy guy, I gotta go. I know we could sit and talk for hours, you
You're
guys.
the busiest guy I know.
Thank you so much. Thanks for bringing the guitars and such great knowledge you have. So sorry I gotta go, but I'm busy.
All right.
Well,
understand.
should
Thanks
we?
for being on the show. Busyguy.co. If you want more information, check it out. Perry's Music Tune.